Hello and welcome to Birding Basics. My name is Carolyn with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and today we get to look at woodpeckers. Now, I'm really excited to do this because woodpeckers are one of those birds where you don't need years of experience as a birder or even to have been in the habit of noticing birds in order to know what a woodpecker is. It's not one of those birds that's really cryptic that you have to really go out of your way to search out of. It's present in popular media, even if woodpecker has all sorts of problems that we're not going into today. So it's one of those really great birds that is accessible to people, and yet at the same time there's a ton of really cool things that you can learn about if you take the time and really look at the details. So we're going to be doing a little bit of that today before we delve into the many species of woodpeckers that we actually have present here in our county that you can go and search out and find. So let's get started by defining some of the adaptations and features that you're going to be noticing in the woodpeckers that you see out in the field. So right off the bat, I do want to address the coloration. We've got a number of species of woodpeckers that show up in our county, and there's a ton that are in North America. And if you open up your field guide, and Sibley's is nice because they show us all of the woodpeckers together on one page. And if you're flipping through, you're going to notice there's a trend of woodpeckers being black and white birds with some variation on the red head. And right off the bat, that's difficult. It's always a challenge when birds are variations on a theme. So they're all shaped the same, they're behaving in similar manners, and then there's very small details to set them apart. So that's always a pain. We're going to be looking at those a little bit more closely so you can actually figure out what field marks you should be paying attention to. But in the case of woodpeckers, that actually gives us a couple of advantages. The first being black and white is easy to spot. So whether it is on a tree trunk or upside down on a tree branch, if it is flying through the air, black and white catches your eye. And the nice thing about it is you're not relying on or having your eye be interfered with variable lighting conditions. The dark and the light is going to show up, which is great. It makes our lives a little bit easier. It also means you can pick out the patterns more easily from a distance, which is always a plus because, the birds are not very cooperative. They don't care about giving you that perfect angle so you can see their back or take a good look at their breast or get that nice profile view in order to see whether or not it's got a malar stripe or a supercilium visible. So the black and white coloration that our woodpeckers tend to stick with is to our advantage here. And there's not a ton of birds that we're going to be finding in our trees at least that are going to have those bold black and white patterns. So that'll help you out as well. There are a couple of exceptions to this black and white coloration theme, but we will be actually taking a closer look at them, and the advantages of those guys are if you recognize that it's a woodpecker, but it's not black and white, there's only a couple of options for it to actually be. So that's our coloration. It is one of the first things you will notice if you open up your field guide to turn to the woodpeckers. Now, another thing to keep an eye out for is actually flight. And right across the screen here, we actually have the flight pattern of a woodpecker. You notice it's a wavy line, and that dotted line is the undulating pattern of the flight. So at its peak, the bird is coasting, the wings aren't very active, they're just spread out, and then as it dips down, it's going to re-engage those wings to lift off again. Woodpeckers are large enough that this is a relatively smooth motion. It's not bopping up and down like a finch would, and this is one of those things that you tend to notice out in the field more than actually sit down and study. But groups of birds tend to have certain patterns of flight. So the buteo hawks are going to be circling as they soar, very little movement of the wings. If you're looking at something like a swift, its wings are going to be outstretched. A lot of its turning is being done by its tail, and it'll just give tiny little flicks of wing movement as needed. It's pretty imperceptible, and it looks really twitchy when it does that. And that can help you, if not narrow down to the species, at least get you in the right group of birds. Now, with woodpeckers in particular, posture is something that's super noticeable. So, taking a look at a red-headed woodpecker, which is not a woodpecker we get here in California, but if you are visiting friends on the East Coast, you may search these guys out, and they're just really pretty birds. But we do notice that there's a very straight line between the tail and the back of the bird. Woodpeckers are not one of those birds that you're going to see flicking their tails around, as we notice with things like mockingbirds or other songbirds where that tail is a lot more active. And as with any other animal, there are multiple body parts in play with the posture, the first of which being the tail. And we're going to look at an acorn woodpecker for this one because that tail is really visible. And what's super noticeable about the woodpecker's tail is it's very stiff. The central vein of those tail feathers, the rectrices, are incredibly thick. And the reason for this is woodpeckers are actually using their tails as leverage. We're familiar with the woodpecker feeding strategy of pretty much just drilling into a tree. Now, while there's a lot of impact that happens on the head and the neck, woodpeckers are not super large. They're birds. They don't have a ton of weight to put behind this. So they need to be able to leverage as much energy and strength as possible. So that tail is going to be in contact with the tree trunk, with the tree branch, with the side of your house that it is clinging to as it drills in. And that's where it gets that very straight, stiff posture. It's very upright. In addition, the feet of the woodpecker. So woodpeckers have a foot design that's called zygodactyl. Essentially, they've got 2 toes in front and then they've got 2 toes in back. And what this does is that allows them to cling to surfaces, whether they are upside down, whether it is straight up and down vertical. This gives them the option to move up, down, without having to flip around, unless they want to, which, I mean, they're birds, they're allowed. When we move on from posture, though, we do have to go to what's probably the most distinctive thing about our woodpeckers that we would be totally remiss to move past without mentioning, and that has to be the beak and the tongue. So this is an acorn woodpecker, and it's actually sticking its tongue out, and you'll notice that's a really long tongue. So the tongues of woodpeckers are, one, super long because they have to be able to snake it into the holes they've drilled after any of the insects or grubs that they're trying to feed on, but they're also barbed to actually grab on to this food source. In addition, the beak itself is very straight. It's sharp, it's strong, it's shaped like a chisel. Now, we do get some variation between the species because they're not all using the same foraging strategy. They're not going after all of the same types of food because many of these birds do share habitats, and when you have direct competition for food sources, it doesn't last very long in a natural setting. Somebody's going to win. That's why introduced species tend to cause so many problems in our local ecology, as they just throw all of those competitions and the ecological niches out of balance. But those beaks, those chisel-shaped, strong beaks, are pretty much the calling card of our woodpeckers. And they're what allows our woodpeckers to create their cavities. So woodpeckers are primary cavity nesters. They are the birds who are responsible for digging those holes in the trees that all of our other cavity nesting songbirds make use of. They're incredibly important to the ecosystems that they live in. This is a baby hairy, or a juvenile, sorry, juvenile hairy woodpecker sticking its head out of the cavity nest. So they will drill a hole, they'll excavate an entire cavity in which to build their nests. And those beaks are absolutely essential for that. But they also use their beaks to communicate. Now, this is the drum of a Nettles Woodpecker. It's just tapping. Now, this is not exerting nearly as much force as they would if they were actually trying to excavate into a tree, but it does carry really well over distances. So if a woodpecker is trying to establish territory or anything like that, it's going to be drumming because it carries sound really well, takes less effort. You can, to a certain degree, actually figure out which species of woodpecker is responsible for which drum. That's done by figuring out the beats per second. So if you've got a musical background, that may be easier for you, but it does vary a little bit over distance. So that's something to be aware of. Maybe don't pin your ID on the drums alone. So with all of those shared characteristics, I want to go into the woodpeckers you're going to be finding here in Santa Clara Valley, because we're talking about 8 of them today. And the first of which is our Nettles Woodpecker. Now, these guys are found pretty much all over California, a little bit into Mexico and into Oregon, but they really are a local special, which is kind of odd for us to think about because we see them at least as birders all of the time. They're kind of our neighborhood woodpecker. But if you've got birder friends who are visiting, you know, just sit them in front of your suet feeder, tell them to wait for the Nettles Woodpeckers to come by, and you will make their trip because it really is a very relatively small range for these birds. So this is the male. He's got that bright red head, that laddered back, all those spots on the wings and the back is in really good evidence. That is what you're going to want to be looking for with these birds, that black and white speckled back, the red head on the male, and we've got that lovely little face mask he's sporting with the profile. And then the female has all of those markers except for that red head. So with many, or a fair number at least, of our woodpeckers, it's pretty straightforward to tell the males from the females. Generally it has to do with that red that you'll notice in your field guide. And they do have a pretty distinctive call. It carries well, and you've probably heard it walking around your neighborhood. These are birds that prefer oak woodlands, but as I mentioned, they can be found all throughout your neighborhoods. They like the suburbs. If you've got a park, if you've got a water source that runs through your neighborhood, odds are pretty good you've also got Nettles Woodpeckers. Now, moving on from our Nettles Woodpeckers, we have the Downy Woodpecker. He's adorable. So I'm not a super big proponent of relying on the size of a bird as an indicator, unless, of course, you're dealing with extremes. In the case of our woodpeckers, the Downy Woodpecker is our extreme on the small side. It's tiny. It's like, you're going to look at it and wonder how it's actually a woodpecker because it's going to be about the same size as the sparrows if it's visiting your feeders. And what I want you to notice here is he's got a very tiny beak. In fact, that beak is so small you're kind of wondering how it's managing to woodpecker. They do manage, but the proportion of that beak to head ratio, the beak is about half the length of the head, and this is going to be important because these guys look very similar to a larger species. We're going to take a look at the female, who once again, lacking that red spot, but that white stripe down the back. It's thick, it's bright, it's going to show up if it is visiting your feeder. If you're seeing it on a tree, odds are pretty good you're going to see that white stripe down the back. But once again, we're paying attention as that bird turns its head in profile to the proportion of the beak to head. We've got the call of the downy, and these guys are actually pretty common visitors to the feeders here at McClellan Ranch. So if you do want to find a downy woodpecker, you're not sure if they're in your neighborhood, come on down to McClellan. They really like visiting the suet feeders, or set up a suet feeder of your own. You'll get all sorts of really cool birds visiting it. These are woodpeckers of open woodlands, especially with deciduous trees around, but they'll also venture into parks and neighborhoods as well. Now, looking at their larger doppelganger, this is the hairy woodpecker. So you'll notice it also has that white stripe down its back, as opposed to the sort of laddering pattern that our Nettles was showing. The males, once again, have a red spot on the back of the head. But I want you to pay attention to the beak, because not only is the hairy woodpecker a significantly larger woodpecker than the downy is, its beak is pretty much the same length as its head. So we've got equal proportions there. So while don't rely on size, you can rely on the proportions. And that's also a trick that's helpful if you're looking at things like shorebirds, where the beak is really, really important. And once again, familiarizing yourself with the calls of the woodpeckers is really helpful, because they live where there are trees. So you aren't always guaranteed to get a clear view. So it always pays off to familiarize yourself with the calls, but when you know you're going to be going into habitat where visibility is going to be limited, definitely spend the time, brush up on those calls, or have them on your phone and just play them in your ear so you can double check. They're larger woodpeckers, so you're going to have to look for mature woodland. Larger trees are going to be these birds' friends. But, of course, that's not the only woodpeckers we have. The acorn woodpecker, these guys are a favorite for our oak savannas. You can find them all over the county, especially with open woodland. They're called acorn woodpeckers. If you've got oak trees, odds are pretty good you're going to see these guys too. What's really notable about our acorn woodpeckers is, one, that harlequin mask that's really vibrant on its face. It's got a fully dark back, so we don't have any of that white patterning that we saw with our other species. The males have a red cap. The females will also show that red cap, but it's a little bit less. There's black dividing the white face mask from the red. And of course, this bird is on part of its granary tree. And this is a really distinctive behavior for these birds. They keep granaries in which they will shove acorns. They will riddle a tree trunk or a snag with holes, and they will just shove acorns in there for the lean times of the year. And they will feed on those acorns. If the acorn shrinks as it dries out, they will move it to a different hole. And they're pretty social for woodpeckers. They live in groups, and they will defend their granary trees. So you don't tend to see just one acorn woodpecker. You'll see a couple, and you will always hear them. Ed Levin is a great place to find these birds. But as I mentioned, Oak Savanna, we've got a number of parks in our county where that habitat is prevalent. You can find these guys in many, many places. Now, moving on to the other woodpecker that I'm going to say, totally use size as an indicator for yourself. It's a field mark that's valid for these guys. The Pileated Woodpecker. These guys are probably, odds are really good that they're our largest woodpecker, and I don't say that because we're confused about the size of them, but because the ivory-billed woodpecker, which is slightly larger, is probably extinct. Odds are really good that it's extinct. There was a couple of questions regarding that status a couple years back when there was possibly a sighting in the Everglades where they live. A couple problems with that. It was never a verified sighting by experts. and it's the Everglades, so it's a little bit tricky to search, but that's a species of bird that's probably extinct. Now the pileated is a higher elevation woodpecker. It's definitely a bird of mature forests. It's a more northern species. We do have them here. The Santa Cruz Mountains are really your best bet for them because they do like really large trees. Sanborn Park is a good spot to find these birds. And once again, you know, you've got a call that's going to carry. But I mentioned that it's a bird of mature forests because these guys need large trees. And the reason for that is this is what they like to do with trees. So you know if there's a pileated woodpecker in the woods feeding on those trees because it'll look like somebody either took a chainsaw to it, because reasons, nobody's asking the pileated woodpeckers why they're doing this, or, you know, just by drilling holes, it looks like somebody unloaded a shotgun with buckshot directly into a tree branch. So they do a ton of damage to the trees. It is very distinctive. They actually have specialized nostrils to keep the sawdust out. So, you know, why not cause as much destruction as possible? They're really cool birds, though. This guy, breaking free from our trend of monochromatic woodpeckers, we have our northern flicker. It is actually a woodpecker, although they're not drilling holes as much. They've got a little bit more delicate beak, although they are still capable of excavating their own holes. This is a really pretty bird. It's got spots, it's got that little black bib. The males, at least for the red-shafted, because we do have a regional divide of yellow-shafted and red-shafted. We're talking about the red-shafted because we are on the west coast, but if you are on the east coast, you're going to be looking at yellow-shafted. Has a red mustache, which does show up pretty well. If you look closely at the underside of this bird's tails, though, you can see that it is bright orange. Now, colors and their naming conventions have changed over the years. That's why it's red-shafted when it's, you know, obviously orange. But this female is demonstrating a little bit better, a little bit more visible. So she doesn't have that red mustache, but you can see those bright orange wing feathers. Now this is on the underside of the wing. So what happens is when these birds are in flight, you actually get these flashes of orange or yellow, depending on where you're at, which is super, super visible. And once again, distinctive call that's going to be carrying pretty dang well. If you're looking out for northern flickers in our area, right now we've had sightings at the Sierra Azul OSP. It's South County, but it's worth checking out. And you're going to be finding these birds in open woodlands on the edges of fields, within the suburbs and the parks. They don't need a really densely wooded area, unlike some of our other woodpeckers. Now we've got another kind of rarity for the county, and this is our Lewis's woodpecker. So rather than being black and white, it's got a white breast with a little bit of a rosy wash towards the stomach, and a dark green iridescence on the head and the back. So they're very, very pretty birds. It's going to be breeding in ponderosa pines forests that have been impacted by fires. I've got to be honest, like, we get them here in our county, but if you just want a reliable sighting of this woodpecker, just drive over Mount Hamilton. The San Antonio Valley Road is a really reliable birding site for these guys. You can search them out, but there haven't been any recent sightings in our county. And just do yourself a favor, put in the road trip for a day. You'll get some really cool birds out of it. You'll see some gorgeous countryside, get out of the city, wear your mask, find the Lewis's woodpecker. And then coming to our last species, this one is actually a seasonal visitor for us because there are migratory woodpeckers. So the rest of those that we were talking about were residential, here year-round. This is our red-bellied sapsucker, though. Still a woodpecker, despite the different name. And it's pretty. You can take a look at it and once again, names based on specimens means that sometimes the features are not super visible when the bird is alive. It does have a red belly, but it's hidden when the bird is breathing. But we do have that really very visible head and breast that is bright, bright red, the black and white wings. And the sapsuckers have a really cool feeding behavior that is worth looking out for, because you'll notice it throughout the year, even though they're only here for us in the wintertime. And it's these wells. So this is a yellow-bellied sapsucker, but those tiny, tiny holes underneath it are the wells that it's drilled. And what they'll do is they will actually drill those wells and then return back to them throughout the year, throughout the days. So they'll return to the wells every day to not just gather up the sap that's welled up in the meantime as the tree is trying to heal from the shallow grooves that have been dug into its bark, but they're also collecting the insects. So if you find a tree where a sapsucker has drilled some fresh holes, just keep an eye on it throughout the day. Come back a couple of times during the week, and you may be able to catch the sapsucker visiting it. And once again, familiarizing ourselves with the calls, because these are birds that are going to be found in the woods. Although our sapsuckers in the wintertime, it's a variety. They like visiting orchards. And we do get them here in McClellan. And it's not the time of year for it, but if you're walking along the trail between Blackberry and McClellan Ranch, you are going to see a number of trees that have evidence of the sapsucker wells. And they're just really symmetrical, shallow holes that have been drilled very close together in the tree bark. So, with that, have a great day, great rest of your week. Get outside this weekend, wear a mask, and go find yourself some woodpeckers, because they are well worth the effort. They've always got some really cool behaviors, and I will see you all next week.